If God wrote the Bible, what kind of evidence would he leave? It's awake. We are from SAPS. I think we've established that. This is our 6th week. Tonight we're looking at prescience and conclusions of the 6 sets of evidence that we should find if God wrote the Bible. We've found 5 good positive sets so far, and we have good hope for tonight. Now, you're the one who made the comment about the fire hose. I have got a fire hose on steroid tonight. Prescience, law of thermodynamics. There are a couple laws of thermodynamics, actually several. First law, matter is neither created nor destroyed by normal chemical means. What this very simply says is things don't just pop into existence. The matter that's here can be changed in form, but it doesn't just pop into existence. Incidentally, evolution violates that law the first thing. Because according to the Big Bang, originally there was nothing, and then suddenly out of nothing came everything. That violates the first law. It violated another law 1/2 second later, but I won't go into that one right now. What's interesting is this first law, which evolution violates, is well known in Scripture. Psalms 148, establish them forever and ever. He has made a decree which shall not pass away. Things don't just pop in and out of existence. 2 Peter 3, all things continue as they were from the beginning of creation. Folks, I just gave you a sample of a couple. There are a dozen scriptures which show that the Bible understood the first law of thermodynamics and understood 3,000 years before men figured it out. Second law, another common sense thing. Now they call it entropy, but everything's wearing out. I bet you're not wearing the same shoes you wore 40 years ago. Now, weird thing, God exempted that one time. Do you remember in the Bible when God exempted clothes to where they wore the same clothes for 40 years?
Oh, and it doesn't work
when they were on the Exodus. Yeah, but that's a God thing. You're not using the same car you had 40 years ago. Everything wears out. Becomes more disordered over time. Genesis 3, cursed is the ground, both thorns and thistles shall bring it forth. In the sweat of your face shall she eat bread till you return to the ground. It takes work to produce something on this planet because you're fighting entropy. You're fighting this, everything goes to disorder. Romans 8, the creation was subjected to futility and everything is getting corrupted. You leave a nice little cake outside on the ground. What happens in a very short period of time?
Gone.
It's gone one way or the other. If the ants don't get it and the animals don't get it, the sun and the rain and everything else gets it. Psalms 102, everything in the earth and the heavens is growing old like a garment. 3,000 years ago, the Bible understood the second law of thermodynamics. Now, here's my son Tom's room when he used to live with us, if company was coming. This is the only time it looked this good. On a normal day, here's his room. Because the law of entropy works. Without putting order into things, without putting work into things, everything becomes what?
Chaos.
Disordered. This is the second law. And the Bible understood it, but evolution does not. Because everything is wearing out, wearing down. But evolution says everything is wearing up. We're getting more complex. We were once a one-celled organism, then multi-celled, then fish, amphibian, reptile, mammal to man. We're getting more complex. Is that what you experience? Everything's getting better?
No.
No. In point of fact, are we accruing more diseases and more mutated problems all the time?
Yeah.
We are. We are degrading, which is what the Bible would tell us. Ecclesiastes 1:7 has a fascinating piece of the water cycle in it. All streams flow into the sea, yet the sea is never full. To the place the streams come from, there they return again. Now you could say, well, wait a minute. And this was written by Solomon about 2,900 years ago. Well, that's just common sense. We know how the water cycle is, and they've always figured that out. No, they didn't. Thales Miletus, a Greek in the 6th century BC, said, you know, the rain and the snow, that's just not enough to fill the rivers and all that kind of stuff. So there must be all this water underground that's feeding everything. So that was the 6th century BC answer. Aristotle, 4th century BC, he agreed with Thales. It has to all be coming from underground. The sky's just not enough. Da Vinci in 1500 AD said, you know, it is all coming, the mountain streams are all coming from underground water. He agreed with both of them. Galileo in 1600 AD was frustrated because he simply couldn't figure out where all the water was coming from. They had no clue of the water cycle. It wasn't until 1674 that a guy named Pierre Seine, why does that last name sound familiar? Seine River Valley, where the Seine River originates and which flows through Paris, if you don't know that. At any rate, he calculated how much rainfall was going into that Seine Valley each year and found out that that was sufficient not only to water the ground and to soak the ground, but also to feed the river. And from him, we got the start of the water cycle. So how did the Bible get this one right almost 3,000 years before him? Well, it didn't just get it right once. In the oldest book of the Bible, Job, it talks about evaporation, condensation, precipitation. Whereas everybody for the next 2,500 years will be talking about how we get it out of the ground. More in Job, the formation of clouds from water vapor. Genesis and Psalms talks about groundwater from springs. Psalms 135 talks about evaporation. Psalms 104, precipitation. Isaiah about the infiltration of the ground by the water. Deuteronomy about dew and rainwater. And Isaiah talks about floods and desert streams. Folks, the Bible understood the water cycle thousands of years before men did. Ecclesiastes, cloud movement, and the trade winds. Isaiah 40:22 said that God sat upon or sat above the circle of the earth. Now, Isaiah, that was written approximately 2,700 years ago. How did he know the world was round? This was during a period of time that people thought it might be flat, it might be never-ending. They had all sorts of ideas. There are ways that people could figure that out. For example, in this case, if you understood the mechanics of the solar system, there would be eclipses. And when an eclipse occurs, you have a circular or rounded shadow that goes across. And if you understood the mechanics of the solar system, you could get an idea, ooh, the Earth is blocking the sun and it's round. But did they understand the mechanics of the solar system? No, they didn't. So maybe they did and maybe they didn't on that one. But what's interesting about all the things I'm going to show you tonight is the Bible gets these things right in science every time, 100% of the time. It's going to violate the odds that way. Now here's one they couldn't figure out for themselves. Job's 26:7, the earth hangs in space above nothing, it says. How'd they get that one? And this is from the oldest book in the Bible, Job. 3,800 years ago, the Bible understood, God had told him, that the earth hangs in space. At the same time that this is written, the Hindus believe that the earth is riding on the back of a celestial turtle through the universe. They were wrong. The Greeks believed that Atlas was holding up the world. And yet the Bible understood that we what? We're hanging in space. And there's no way they could have figured that out except with the Creator's help. 1 Corinthians 15, each star is different. When you are a shepherd, 3,000 years ago, and you are lying out under the open sky at night, you count the stars, and we'll talk about their counting the stars. But some stars look different, but a lot of them look the same. They look the same. And yet now that we have powerful telescopes, what we figured out, we have never found two stars which are exactly alike. There are main categories of stars. For example, our star, the sun, is a G2 main sequence yellow dwarf. It's part of a classification called G2 main sequence. However, those yellow dwarfs like that all vary. There is no one star, one yellow dwarf we found that's exactly like our sun, and I'll show you later we can be thankful for that. Since those stars up in the sky, many of them look the same, how did the Bible know correctly that every star is different? That they all vary in size, temperature, their refraction of light, or their light signature, etc. Hebrews 11:3, creation is made of invisible elements. How did they know that we're made up of atoms or molecules? That there's stuff smaller than we can ever see?
They didn't know there were atoms and molecules.
No, they didn't know that. That's a true statement. This is during a time when the culture of the day taught that there were 4 elements. What were those 4 elements? Earth, wind, fire, and water. That's it. And that everything was made up of those. And you can see those. Okay, except for the wind kind of. But here we're being told that everything is made up of hidden elements. Again, kind of interesting they got that one right. Job 38, light moves. At the time that this was written, and for a couple of thousand years afterwards, they thought that light was instantaneous, because the minute we turn on the light, well, guess what? It's there. They did not understand that it moves and it could have a measured speed, but Job referred to that. Jeremiah, the stars are uncountable. When you are that shepherd or whoever who's out under the stars 3,000 years ago, sometimes they couldn't get to sleep and they didn't count sheep, because sheep is what they mess with all day long. What they counted was stars. And you can look at the ancient records and find out that they had good counts on the number of stars in the northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere. In the northern hemisphere, they counted just about 3,000 stars. In the southern hemisphere, about the same. This was to the naked eye, another 3,000 stars. So it was pretty well established from around 3,000 years ago to 2,000 years ago that there was about 6,000 stars up in the sky. They had a number. That number was wrong. What happened when Galileo made a telescope? Suddenly there's millions more. And every time we build a bigger telescope, Hubble, Webb, what do we see? More. They are uncountable. Whoa, how did the Bible get that one right? 2 Samuel and Jonah, the ocean floor has deep valleys and mountains. Any of those guys who wrote this, were they at the bottom of the Marianas Trench? How do they know that? But especially since, because you always try to figure out what were they doing. If you walk out from any island or any coastline, what do you find? This gentle sand. This gentle sand and that type of stuff. You're not usually finding valleys, mountains, and those type of things. Job 38, the ocean has springs. They may have figured that out because they saw these bubbling springs close to the shoreline. But again, the Bible got this one right. Job 28, air has weight. There is discussion from Aristotle on up for 2,000 years about the lightness of being, and that air is weightless, which kind of makes sense. It just hangs around, you know. But the Bible knew that the air had weight and got that right 2,800 years before men. Biogenesis. According to the Bible, everything reproduces according to its kind. That says something very simple. If a cow has a calf, what comes out? A calf, a cow. If an alligator has a young one, they have a what? Another alligator. You don't have a giraffe having a baby and out comes a gorilla. And you're laughing, but incidentally, that's basically what one form of evolution says. There's a form of evolution called punctuated equilibrium, started by Stephen Jay Gould of Harvard some 30 years ago. And Gould recognized this, that there are no no transition forms in the record. You're told by other evolutionists there are. We don't find them in the fossil records. We don't find a half cow, half anything else, a half ape, half human. The missing links are called missing links because they're still missing. But Gould recognized this, and so he came up with this idea of, for 500 million years, everything that's there will stay the same. Shrimp will stay the same, humans will stay the same, and then suddenly either the sun goes nuts and bombards us with radiation, or we suddenly get a whole lot of asteroids that bring E. coli, bacilli, new genetics into the world, and suddenly everything mutates in a very short period of time, and an alligator lays an egg and out comes a bird. And if you doubt me on that stupid statement, I invite you to check out in the library the writings of Stephen Jay Gould of Harvard or Goldschmidt of UC Berkeley. He has a theory, he calls it his hopeful monster theory. This is what they call science, and it's not science. The Bible knew long ago that life only comes from life. Evolution talks about spontaneous generation, that life just pops into being. Incidentally, that violates what? The first law of thermodynamics. And that chemicals can simply organize themselves. They don't organize up, they organize where? Down. They degrade. Second law of thermodynamics. Pasteur, just 200 years ago, figured out that life comes from life. But the Bible figured that one out 3,800 years ago. Abiogenesis, that's the crux of evolution. They say at some point, dirt and water and chemicals got together and life was formed by accident. Has that ever been observed or repeated in a laboratory?
No.
Never. Now what they've done is a lot of Humpty Dumpty. They've taken God's pieces apart, put them back together, and they worked, which shows how good God's stuff is. But they have never created their own life. Yes, sir?
It reminds me of the one-liner, the little joke about the guy comes up to St. Peter's play and he says, "We ought to really be proud. I figured out how to create life." And he went to reach down and pick up the dirt, and St. Peter's said, "No, you got to bring your own dirt."
You can't have your own dirt because God made that too. That's a very true statement. Why are cool mist vaporizers so helpful for us? You get a cold, break up the mucus and that type of stuff, both cool and hot vaporizers. What were we told about the early Earth? That there wasn't rain initially, that there was a mist which came up from the ground and watered the whole Earth. So Adam and Eve were initially in a very humid environment. When you put out a vaporizer, you are duplicating the environment that you were made for, which is helpful for you.
That's interesting, yeah.
If you didn't know how George Washington died, I'm going to tell you the rest of the story. Little Paul Harvey here. Thursday, December 12, 1799. Exposed to snow and 30-degree weather. Friday, he developed a tracheal and upper respiratory infection. This can be gleaned from a friend of his who wrote this all in his diary. Now, he believed in bloodletting, which had been done for centuries. In point of fact, last time we were here, we talked about how the Egyptians did that during Moses' time. Well, they practiced it at this point, to take the bad humors, the poisons out of you. He had a neighbor, the guy wasn't a doctor, but he did bloodletting. Now, incidentally, he had to ask him over kind of in secret because Martha did not believe in bloodletting, his wife. But he ignored Martha, and he brought the bloodletter over and had some blood taken out. Saturday morning, the doctor arrived at 11 a.m. He wasn't any better, so the doctor, this is the doctor doing it, drew a basin of blood. The second drawing of blood. No better, doctor drew another basin in the early afternoon and another 32 ounces at 4 p.m. What's happening?
A little low. Blood.
He's being bled to death.
Yeah.
He deteriorated further and died at 11 p.m. Well, duh. Washington was literally bled to death. It tells us in Leviticus 17:11, the life of the flesh is in the blood. This guy was a Christian. He was a believer if he believed enough in the Bible to pay attention to this, or if he'd listened to his wife. and I'm not going to touch either of them. He
However,
might have lived a while longer. Okay?
There's the lesson right there.
Another story.
Save your life.
Matthew Maury was a Virginian man of the sea. He spent 16 years on board the Brandywine and other ships. He had a severe injury in 1841 in his leg, which forced him to retire from the U.S. Navy. He had done a lot of study on the oceans, though, and was put in charge of the Navy Office of Charts and Instruments. Now, this guy was a deep believer, Matthew Maury, and he read in Psalms 8:8 that there are paths in the sea. Now, I don't know about paths in the sea. I know that if I brush my hand through the water, I see a path, but then it all fills up. But he deeply believed, if God said there's paths in the sea, I'm going to believe it. And in Ecclesiastes 1:6, it says the winds have their circuits. How could anybody know that? Can you see the wind? Now that he was put in charge of that office of instruments and measurements, he required all ships using his office to keep records of sea currents and winds. Through that data that he collected and the previous data that they already had, he discovered the mid-latitude winds we call the trade winds from this data. This is how the trade winds were discovered, because a deep believer believed in exactly what he's read in the Bible, that it wasn't poetic, that it was literal. He also, from that data, rediscovered and redefined the Gulf Stream and discovered the Pacific cold water current. They had known about the Gulf Stream for some period of time. Ben Franklin actually, in one of his books, had a depiction of the Gulf Stream, but it wasn't well defined, and it was basically forgotten about. But Maury rediscovered it and defined it well through his data, and then also found the cold water stream that comes from Antarctica across the west coast of the U.S. That's why San Diego, LA, and San Francisco have such moderate climates. They're so basically cool. And the inset map at the bottom is the drawing from Ben Franklin's book. His discoveries cut as much as 3 weeks off some transoceanic voyages. They no longer would fight the Gulf Stream coming from Europe to the Atlantic, and they would use the Gulf Stream going from North America to Europe, etc. And they would avoid bad trade winds, which also helped in terms of safety. A plaque on a Virginia monument to him reads, he was a genius. Was he? Or was he just a Christian who firmly believed in what he read? Now let's talk about the seed of woman. Genesis 3:15 is known by some as the Proto-Evangelium. It's supposed to be the first prediction of Christ, of the Messiah coming. It says, and I will put enmity between thee and the woman, and between thy seed and her seed, and it shall bruise thy head, and thou shalt bruise his heel. Now, I'm not going to go through the prediction of what this may be the first prediction of Christ as much as talk about the human seed in woman. Now, biologically, we all know today that a male's semen mixes with a female's egg, and each contributes 23 chromosomes of genetic information. But the ancient view, held for 2,000 years, was that the man's seed was all there genetically was, and the woman was nothing but an incubator. The man put it in, the woman got no credit. Okay? This was a misogynistic worldview, but you were living in misogynistic times. Okay? This is what was understood during the time of Moses, seed only by the male in the womb, and even up to the 6th century BC, Pythagoras echoed this same idea. The discovery of the human female ovum and eggs will not occur until the 19th and 20th centuries AD, and yet the Bible gets this one right in Genesis. In Genesis 3:20 we read, and Adam called his wife's name Eve because she was the mother of all living. Mitochondrial DNA, your mitochondria is the power source of each cell. And there's a small snippet of 1,000 to 2,000 lines of code of DNA in the mitochondria, separate from the nucleus. That's only passed down from the mother. The male contributes nothing. When you When you're born, you're getting mitochondrial DNA from your mother. Mitochondrial DNA evidence says that all humans, all races came from the same primordial woman. This is called the Eve syndrome. This is evidence that we all came from not 5 monkeys, not from 30 original people, but from one original woman. Does that agree with what the Bible tells us?
Yes.
It does. Here's why they really, in the secular circle, do not talk about the Eve syndrome. The way they figured that out was there's a huge amount of similarity in our genetic makeup of that mitochondrial DNA. But over the last several thousand years, there's been a lot of mutations. And so there are different bad copies out there. Well, they supposedly can count how far back it was because we know the mutation rate. Incidentally, the established mutation rate is that we generate or get another 100 mutations in our DNA every 20 to 30 years. Every new generation. Well, if you count how many total mutations there are in the mitochondrial DNA and go back to check how long ago this original woman was, that date comes up to be 6,000 to 8,000 years ago. Wait a minute. Does that agree with the evolutionary time scale? No. According to the evolutionary time scale, the first humans got here somewhere between 250 million 250,000 to 1 million years ago. But this one says 6,000 to 8,000, measuring the mitochondrial differences in DNA. Exactly what the Bible would tell us. Noah's daughters-in-law. DNA reveals 3 types of mitochondrial DNA. We all came from one woman, but then there are 3 classifications of that DNA. Suggests we came from 3 women. The Bible says that the human race was repopulated after the worldwide flood by the offspring of the 3 sons of Noah. Is it just accidental that the Bible got this genetic anomaly right, and this was only discovered in the last 20 years? This genetic data matches exactly the biblical story of us starting over with 3 sets of DNA after the flood. Adam named his wife Eve because she would be the mother of all living. Wow, I'm hungry. Cain, stop pushing me. Help. I can't get down. Mine, mine, mine. Not only was Eve the mother of all living, there were many times she probably certainly felt like it. If you've ever listened to Ken Ham from Answers in Genesis, who does a great job, we do have on tape one interview we had with him on our radio show. Ham often asks, what should we find if a worldwide flood occurred? You know what he always says to that? If a worldwide flood occurred, we should find millions of dead things buried in rock layers laid down by water all over the earth. And he says it that fast. Okay? Well, what do we find when we dig into the earth? Millions of dead things buried in rock layers laid down by water all over the earth. This is observational science, folks. We make a prediction based upon what the Bible tells us and what there should be, and when we dig down there, that's what we find. You don't make a fossil by something dying and just laying on the ground. It doesn't make a fossil. What happens? It gets et. If the mammals don't do it, the ants and the bacteria do it. The only way you get a fossil is if it's rapidly covered in sediment, which is exactly what we're talking about with the worldwide flood. We are all held together by God's power. Colossians 1. For in him all things were created, things in heaven and earth, visible and invisible, and in him all things hold together. You may not know it, but there are linchpins that hold your cells together. They're called laminins. And if we did not have these linchpin molecules that hold every one of the 60 trillion cells in each one of your bodies together, you would be on the floor just a pile of jello. Because this is the scaffolding that holds us together. Here's what a laminin molecule looks like. Do you think it's any accident that this linchpin that holds us together looks like the cross of Christ? I'm not sure it is. In fact, I'm pretty sure it is.
Wow, that's so
Pretty
cool.
close.
Yep. We are all held together by God's power. Some atomic level, there are 4 forces that we've recognized in nature: gravitational, electromagnetic, strong, and weak nuclear forces. We have no clue, none whatsoever, how these things work. It's theorized that there's zero-point energy in the vacuum of space, that space is actually not empty, that there's a fabric to it. They used to, during Einstein's time, they used to call this the ether. And they weren't talking about a gas, they were talking about the fabric of space. But we are convinced now, because how does, for example, light waves move through space if there's not a fabric to move through? This zero-point energy could be a sign of Christ's power holding everything together. We're starting to get the idea, almost from Star Wars, of that everything is connected, that everything is up by Christ. God's holding this together is as scientific as our guesses. Because again, when I propose this, that there's zero-point energy and Christ is holding everything together, how much do we know about electromagnetic, gravitational, strong, and weak nuclear forces? Absolutely nothing. We recognize those forces, but we can't have no clue how they work. The Bible had it right. There are forces or powers which literally hold us together and which are invisible to the naked eye, as alluded to not only in Corinthians, but also in Hebrews 11. God said it, He did it. The earth was formed to be inhabited. This was written 2,700 years ago in the Old Testament scripture of Isaiah. It says, "For this is what the Lord says, He who created the heavens, He is God. He who fashioned and made the earth, He founded it. He did not create it to be empty, but formed it to be inhabited. He says, I am the Lord and there is no other." Look how earnest He is about that. There's a whole field of study called the anthropic principle. There are numerous cosmological constants which numerical values fall within an incredibly narrow range. In point of fact, there are over 200 things, like the gravitational constant, like the weak nuclear force, the strong nuclear force, that if they weren't fine-tuned to an extremely small strength, life couldn't exist. We wouldn't be here. Not one, not two, but over 200 of these. If a single one of those 200 constants were outside that very narrow range, fine-tuned for life, there would be no life. This is a mathematical impossibility. It shows God providentially engineered the universe to suit our specific needs. The universe appears to have been fine-tuned for our existence. One example is the weak force, what I call the weak nuclear force, one of the 4 primordial forces. This is what holds a neutron together. If it was a few percent weaker, we would have far fewer or no neutrons, little helium, and few heavy elements, and they'd all stay in the stars. They would never get to us. If it's a few percent stronger, you have too many neutrons, too much helium, and too many heavy elements, but again, they would combine and stay within the stars, and they would never get to us. And that's just one example of how the whole universe is fine-tuned for our existence. Earth is a one-of-a-kind place. You had Carl Sagan many years ago. That guy was an atheist. He is now a creationist because he's dead. He's met God, and he understands the truth of the matter. But he said that the earth was just a little speck in the whole sea of the universe. We were insignificant. Well, we are very significant. We reside within the galactic Goldilocks or halo zone, away from radiation, gravity at the center, or between spiral arms. We are actually not in the center, but between spiral arms in the Milky Way galaxy. If we were within a spiral arm or at the center, we would be bombarded by so many radiations and so many things trying to hit us that we wouldn't exist. We wouldn't live. We are within the circumstellar halo zone, within our solar system. We are in the Goldilocks place where it's not too hot and not too cold, to where we don't fry or freeze. Our sun is a main sequence G2 dwarf. 90% of all stars in the universe are smaller than our sun. Now there are some others that are huge, much bigger than our sun. but 90% of them are smaller. In fact, 75% of those are what are called red dwarfs. If we were circling a red dwarf, to be in that Goldilocks zone, close enough to have decent warmth but not be fried, we'd have to be so close to that star that we would be in tidal lock. What does tidal lock mean? It's what Mercury is, and it's what the moon is. One side would always face the sun, and one side would be away. Well, what happens in that case?
You bet.
One side fries and the other side freezes. That's exactly what happens. That doesn't make for life. Our sun is not only the right size for us, it gives off the right type of energy and is incredibly stable. We have found very few stars that are as stable as our sun. Because if it was unstable, as we find with all red dwarfs, it would automatically fry us every time that it had some type of mega eruption. Very rare stability for our star. It was made for us. Here's a picture of the Goldilocks zone that our Earth resides in. If we were just 5% closer, we'd fry. If we were 10% further away, we would freeze. We live in a Goldilocks zone. We're protected by the gas giants. I don't know whether you noted it, but about 25 years ago, there was a heck of a lot of comet debris that hit Jupiter. It was called the Shoemaker-Levy comet set. That is what Jupiter, Saturn, and a whole lot of other outer bodies have been doing for us for a long piece of time. These things that could run into us are being swept clean by the outer gas giants. We have a nearly circular orbit. What would be true if we had a very long elliptical orbit? Whenever we got near the sun, we fry, and whenever we got far away, we'd freeze. We have a nearly circular orbit in that habitable zone. This is starting to get a lot, folks, that all of these things would be perfectly this way. Oxygen-rich atmosphere. We need oxygen. But why do we not have pure oxygen? Why wouldn't God give us that? Anybody know what happened on Apollo 1? Apollo 1. 3 astronauts were there for what they called a plugs-out test. In pure oxygen, there was a spark underneath Gus Grissom's seat, and all 3 of them died in the fire. That's why current spacecraft use an oxygen mix. They do not use pure oxygen. We would have wildfires everywhere if we were in a pure oxygen environment. Correct mass to hold the atmosphere. If you're as small as Mars, what's happened to Mars's atmosphere? Most of it has gotten away from the planet because it doesn't have enough mass to hold it. But we don't want to be huge, because what would you feel like on the surface of Jupiter? You'd be crushed flat by that huge gravity. We have just the right mass. Orbited by a large moon, giving us a stable climate, holding our 23.5 degree tilt, and mixes water with tides. If the moon weren't there, one, we'd be wobbling like a bad top, because the Earth is not perfectly round. It's about pear-shaped slightly. And we wouldn't hold that nice tilt that gives us our seasons. And we wouldn't have the tides, which mix deep water and give oxygen to the deep parts of our ocean. The moon is critical for all of those things. Plate tectonics, which allows this volcanically active planet to exist in a stable fashion. Ratio of liquid water and the amount of land mass is optimal for supporting life on land. What do we need a lot of? Water. We got problems here in Texas right now. Howdy. It's a terrestrial planet. It recycles itself. Moderate rate of rotation. Way to force matter together. One of the problems they have with the evolutionary views is that they say, well, there was just a bunch of gas and dust originally. This is called the nebular hypothesis. And originally, all of this gas and dust came together to form the sun, to form the planets. You got a problem that was highlighted by Professor Harold Slusher at UTEP years ago. He would ask his freshman students to compare the attraction of 2 helium atoms together, the gravitational attraction of those 2 atoms, versus the vapor pressure that would force them apart. It turns out that the vapor pressure of gas is 40 times greater than the gravitational attraction. So should just random gas and dust in space have ever come together? No, it should have been forced apart. And when you do computer simulations of that, you never get better than a dust bunny. It's the right size. Smaller with a less magnetic field could not protect or keep an atmosphere like Mars. Chance of all this, come on in, sir. The chances of all this occurring for the Earth is 1 out of 1 quadrillion, and that's according to Dr. Guillermo Gonzalez, a PhD, used to be at the University of Arizona State, but once he put together with the Discovery Institute that video on the privileged planet, which talks about all the stuff I've talked about here, he lost his position. Because this does not fit the we are an accident scenario. And we may be alone, because this is a very special place, made for us, made to be inhabited. Just luck, or was it designed? That's too many factors to be just luck. And again, for them to be inhabited, all of everything I talked about is in that video, The Privileged Planet, if somebody else wants to get it later tonight. Cambrian explosion. Complex life first appears on this planet suddenly. According to the Bible, how long did it take to make everything? 6 days. According to evolution, it took about 3 billion years. Wait a minute. When you go down to the level that the secular scientists say was about 530 million years ago, what they call the Cambrian explosion, they have no transitional forms, nothing underneath it. And then suddenly, every body form we see on the planet shows up with no transitions, suddenly. Does that fit the evolutionary idea or the biblical concept? It's the biblical concept. And they don't have a good reason for why this should be. But it's what the Bible says we should find. 20 studies show that if a person attends church on an even semi-regular basis, once a month or more, they will live longer and healthier lives. Do you know Proverbs tells us that again and again? Because God says, if you pay attention to me, I'll pay attention to you. Going to church is good for your health. Multiple scriptures give a promise from God that righteous living and following His commands will be rewarded with good health and longer lives, and you can see Deuteronomy and Proverbs for those. This is verified in observational science.
Verified for me.
Verified in you. Yeah. It gets more personal that way, doesn't it? Yeah. A statistical link is shown between elderly people who go to church regularly who do not develop respiratory problems as fast or as often as non-church goers. Did somebody do a statistical study on that? They did. Let's just take up the Seventh-day Adventists, and we're not going to have any negativism just because they're not Baptists. When Loma Linda University investigated these Adventists, they found out that the men live 6.2 years longer than non-Adventist men in California. The American Cancer Society showed that their women lasted 3.7 years longer than regular women in California. Death rates from all cancers was 60% lower for Adventist men and 76% lower for Adventist women. Lung cancer was 21% lower, colorectal cancer 62% lower, breast cancer 85% lower, and coronary heart disease 66% lower for men, 98% lower for women. It was good to be an Adventist in that study. What about prayer? Confess your faults to one another and pray for one another that ye may be healed. The effectual fervent prayer of the righteous man availeth much. That's told to us in James. Do we believe that? Do we operate on prayer? Did you know there's a huge amount of data on prayer? Does prayer work? How many studies have been done testing a statistical link between prayer and lowering blood pressure and metabolic rate? Any guesses? Don't worry, you're going to be wrong. How many? Lots. 1,200. And over 80% of them have shown a linkage. How many studies have been done on prayer and healing? In the vernacular, they call this remote healing, when you're not in the room. All right? There have been 191 studies done on this. 2/3 have shown a statistical link, and 76% of these studies have had a good, firm scientific design with a control group and an effective group. Cardiologist Randolph Bird conducted a double-blind study on prayer with heart patients. He did this in 82 and 83. Patients did not know whether they were in the prayer group or the controlled non-prayer group. A computer randomly assigned 393 patients from CCU San Francisco General Hospital to either a prayer group or non-prayer group. 57 people declined to be a part of the study, so they were kicked out of the data. No statistical difference in groups' health upon admission. That is, the two groups were basically equally sick. The prayer group patients were assigned to 3 to 7 intercessors with active Christian lives. So 3 to 7 people got their names, were not allowed to contact them in any way. They were given only the patient's first names and general condition and asked to pray daily for rapid recovery and prevention of complications and death. When the study concluded, 10 months later, prayer group was 5 times less likely to need antibiotics. 2.5 times less likely, that's 250% less likely, to suffer congestive heart failure. Folks, if you get a 10% correlation within a medical study, they say, ooh, there's good linkage. 250%, 500%, they have steak dinner and a party because that is an unbelievable linkage. 6% less likely to need intubation or ventilation, 5% less likely to need diuretics, develop pneumonia or cardiac arrest. Now this study was cited for having some poor prayer controls. Now what on earth could be in a poor prayer control? What they said was, too much. What they said was, how do you know that the people who were in the non-prayer group, yeah, you didn't assign people to pray for them, but how do you know that their wife or family weren't praying for them? Because they hadn't control for that. So, next guy does an analogous study in 1999 at St. Luke's Hospital in Kansas City. This was done by Dr. William Harris, and he's an agnostic. What's an agnostic? I don't even think God might be there. He's not a believer. Yeah. He did a 1,000-patient study with strong prayer controls. They interviewed hard each person who was going to be put in the control group, not prayed for, to make sure nobody was praying for him out there. They found the prayer patients did 11% better. Again, statistically significant. Now, previous studies have shown that prayer lowers blood pressure and metabolic rate, alleviates stress, and medicine attributes this to a relaxed state. We're just all doing yoga. Or is there something else involved? Newer studies published in 2005 and 2006 say there was no link between prayer and general patient recoveries. Folks, there are more than 20 studies that show that prayer does work. That it does. So what about this one set of studies that say there's no linkage? It's all junk, this stuff about remote healing. Well, when you analyze this study, you find some interesting things. Instead of people with active Christian lives, as done in the 2 previous studies we showed you on heart patients, what they did was assign an ecumenical group. We are now getting to wokeism. An ecumenical group to pray for them. So who did they have praying for these people? Some Christians, some Catholic monks, some Baha'i faith, some Wiccans, some everything. Okay? Now, if I'm told of the design of this study, as a functioning Christian, do I think this is going to be successful? No. No. If I'm asking Rama to go heal him, or whoever that God is, he ain't there. These studies feature Catholic monks, ecumenical prayer groups. Well, what's the difference with all this? In John 3:3 it says, unless someone is born again, he cannot see the kingdom of heaven. God's first interest in you is what? that you find Him, that you get saved. Now, He answers prayers from non-believers sometimes, but is He really going to plug into you until you've answered that first thing, a relationship with Him?
No.
And so in most cases, these foxhole prayers about God, get my friend out of this, are not going to be listened to. You need a relationship with God. Is there prescience in the Bible? We've shown you more than 40 examples of science knowledge described in the Bible far ahead. Should have been known at that time, and there's more than 100 of them in the book. Who gave the Bible writers such modern scientific insights? It had to come from the Creator, the manufacturer of all things. Now, what we've looked at in this study are these. The Bible contains the original creation story, and its elements are copied in other cultures. We expected to find that, and we went out and found it. And there are some of the evidences we looked at. Geology and history support the Bible, and there's some of the evidences for that. We found Jericho, Sodom, and Gomorrah, and they're just like the Bible describes. The Bible has revealed history in advance on hundreds of occasions. In point of fact, there are 2,000 fulfilled prophecies within the Bible. And we discussed some of those. God has protected His Word in a magical way for the last 4,500 years. Logical cohesion. We talked 2 times ago about the fact that the Bible all hangs together with one mind writing. Even though it was 66 books written over 1,800 years by 40 different authors, it hangs together as one mind writing. And tonight what we've looked at successfully is that the Bible is full of prescience, showing the Creator's knowledge of science thousands of years ahead of men. And how accurate is it? Every time it talks about science, it is 100% accurate. How can it get that lucky if it's not directed by the Creator? The logical conclusion is that there is a God and He wrote the Bible. The question is whether we will believe the evidence and let it bolster our faith or walk away from our Creator. This is when at a church when I normally do an invitation. Conclusions. Faith is in concert with science. They are not mutually exclusive, which is what our secular community wants to tell us. At the end of this time, and at the end of whenever I do a seminar, I can't prove to people that God exists. But what I can prove is that it takes more faith to believe in evolution than it does in God's creation in the Bible. And that's what should be clear at this point. Now, there are certain people that operate on that. You've heard a lie. And the lie is, well, modern science ignores Christianity, ignores God of the Bible. There are guys who don't. Dr. Raven Damadian. Does anybody know what Damadian's? This is a strong Christian doctor. Do you know what his contribution is? Anybody ever had a CRT scan? Yeah. He made the machine. He invented the technology. His Christianity did not get in the way of that. Dr. John C. Sanford, who is the leading plant geneticist in the world. He is professor emeritus at Cornell University. He was initially an atheist, but he became a creationist because of his investigation of genetics of plants and found what in there? Infinite design. Design far brighter than any human being. And it turned an atheist into a creationist. Logic tells us there is a God, and in my book, you'll find certain things like Occam's razor, Pascal's wager, and the unmoved first mover, which talk to this concluding point. Aristotle's unmoved first mover is a logic set that's only been around for about 2,200 years. And basically what it says was, everything has a cause and effect. If a leaf comes off a tree, it's because it was originally made by the tree. And the tree originally had water come into it. And photosynthesis occurred. And the cause the tree is there because another tree had a seed fall there. We keep moving back and back and back. There's always a cause for the effect we see. But if you move all the way back in time, was there a first mover? there was, and that one wasn't moved by anything else. That unmoved first mover is a logical proof of God's existence, which has, again, been around by non-Christians for 2,200 years. Your thoughts and questions, because I'm well done.
So, I was reading in Psalms, I was reading this earlier today, it's Psalm 119, and I'll read a few verses because it's all along what you're saying. So it starts at 89, it says, "Forever, Lord, your word is firmly fixed in the heavens, your faithfulness endures to all generations. You have established the earth, and it stands fast. By your appointment they stand this day, for all things are your servants. If your law had not been my delight, I would have perished in my affliction. I will never forget your precepts, for by them you have given me life." That's 90:30.
I didn't have to write the book. That said it all.
And why that sticks out to me, especially 93, where it says, "Your precepts, for by them you give me life." And when the psalmist is talking about, he's not saying like a spiritual life. He literally means life. And that's something we as believers need to start understanding about our salvation. It's not just some future eternal security. It is happening in a present tense where God is literally saving us, restoring us in our hearts, our minds, our souls, our physical well-being, our mental well-being. I don't know if y'all remember this, but when we were all coming out of COVID, they did a well-being study. Guess who had the best well-being? Guess who were the only people who didn't have a negative well-being, where everyone else was like in the gutter? You know who were the people who actually like had a uptick, a positive improvement?
Christians?
Christians. So it was. And so when literally the Bible saves our lives, I mean, it is literally keeping us from dying in so many ways. And I mean, I believe that, I believe this 100%. You want to live long? Serve God.
We have statistical data.
Yeah, we have statistical data. One of my favorite stories is Caleb. At the end, when they finally are going to the promised land, and Joshua and Caleb are talking to each other, and Caleb's like, what, 80 years old or so? And he looks at Joshua and he says, "I'm 80 years old. I'm stronger now than when I started this journey." I don't know how many people I know who are 80 that were stronger than when they were stronger than when they were 40. I've never met anyone that way, but Caleb was that way. And so, I mean, that's just something that has to really just click in our heads, that literally God is saving us, and the way you are restored in everything in life is by serving Him and following Him and knowing Him. I mean, that's the only thing God knows how to give, is to give life. I mean, He gives life and life more abundantly. And everything about here just shows this is true. I mean, of course, this isn't stuff you're not going to find on CNN or anything like that, because that's not the narrative. But, I mean, just know you have Scripture, but you also got a whole lot of evidence all over the place. If you can just kind of, got a resource, and you can easily say, well, look at that. One of the things I'm incorporating in my life, remembering, is I just finished reading a book called Cold Case Christianity, and he just gives this little phrase: is it possible or is it reasonable? There's a lot of things that are possible or plausible, okay? But is it reasonable? Okay? Evolution, plausible, but is it reasonable? No, it's not. And I think those are the things that we just need to encourage people to just take time to just sit there. Yeah, maybe plausible, but is it really reasonable? Does it really make sense? Is it logical if you just sit down and just take the time and just start kind of poking some holes in it? It'll fall apart pretty quickly. However, the God we serve, His Son Jesus, His Word, there's no holes there. It holds firmly way up. And so I just appreciate what Scott has shared here, and just giving you all a little bit more knowledge. Just recognize, like, God's saving us, and He is saving you in more ways than you even realize. Okay?
Holding us together.
Yeah, literally, He is holding us together. Literally.
What did He tell us in Romans 1:20? Yeah. That the fool who says there is no God is without excuse. Because all you've got to do is look at any part of His creation. A tree is a miracle. You might go make one. You ain't going to be able to do it.
You just have to walk around. The reasons I like to garden is just walk around my garden. You see a flower like an iris and compare it to a daisy, and you tell me that just happened. No way. You know, it's just, it's impossible.
The petals on that flower, what are they governed by? They're governed by both the golden rule of mathematics as well as a Fibonacci sequence. There's design there.
Yes, there has to
everywhere.
be design.
Anything else? We thank y'all for putting up with me and for getting through all this. We do have this stuff that may interest you up here at a price. Again, those 3 books down there are for free because they came to me for free. If you want to sign up for our newsletter, you can. And I do have more copies of my book if somebody wanted to get them. And we thank you.
Well, let's see here. It is 7:33, so how about we close in prayer, and then we'll be dismissed, okay?
Yep.
So let's pray together. Lord God, we thank you so much for this evening. Thank you for just the time we've had with Scott. Thank you so much for just the ministry that him and Ed just do together and how they are just being a service to you. So I just pray your blessing upon them. And I pray that you just give them more and more opportunities just to share, Lord God, what is true, what is real, and that it just encourages more people to take a harder look at you so that they can come to know you as Lord and Savior. And so, Lord, I pray that you just watch over us, keep us safe, and just bring us back here again on Sunday. And Lord, I ask, just send the rain. I know there's opportunities in the air, but Lord, I pray that you just increase those opportunities because we just need it so bad right now. So I just ask that you just bring that here, Lord, so that we can just give you praise and glory. So, Lord, we do love you and praise you. In your Son, Jesus' name I pray.